The single best thing about this radio station and this show, I think, is the fact that daily we strive to bring you experts, analysis, insight from people who know of what they speak. With that in mind, back to Ukraine with Lieutenant Colonel Frank Dowse, Marine officer of 20 years, designated Foreign Area Officer, specialized in the former Soviet Union, assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency, was detailed to the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, where he was responsible for military-to-military contact programs and security assistance. He has a master's degree in international security affairs from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. We've seen him on Fox and CBS and other cable news. We've heard him on the Hugh Hewitt Show right here, and we welcome him on our Turnkey.pro answer line this morning. Colonel, thank you for your time in advance, sir, and your service to our country.
Oh, John, it's a pleasure. I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
As a man who has been there, when you think of Ukraine and even Crimea, how fractured is the population as to those who are looking to the West and the freedoms and those who are looking to Mother Russia and the security?
Well, John, that's an excellent question. That is at the key. That's at the heart of much of the instability that's taking place, and it really is ground zero in Crimea. There's a lot of talk about the ethnic Russians that are in Crimea and the history of Crimea and so on, and that's all very, very true. And we see that unfolding in mainland Ukraine, if you will, as well. But the Ukrainians, for the most part, and the Russians, for the most part, have lived in relative harmony, certainly in the Crimean Peninsula. These things get whipped up, as we can see, and you can see this in Russian media, which has gone full Baghdad Bob propaganda at this point. And a lot of that is adding to the fervor, and there's no doubt about it. There's grievances there. There are historical and cultural tensions that have been there for years. So, but when I was traveling in and out of Crimea, actually, I lived there on occasion. I remember transiting from the Ukrainian side of Sevastopol naval facility over to the Russian side, where we would have shashlik and drink vodka and have beer and talk to the Russians. So it's a much different construct. It's
handy that you speak not only Russian but Ukrainian.
Я можу розмовляти трошки українською мовою. Yes, I do speak Ukrainian, some Ukrainian as well.
So if you were to sum it up, I guess the population, I know that the naval base for the Russians, and including when it was the Soviet Union, it's been there for the better part of 2 centuries, is the first instinct of the population there survival?
Yeah, with regards to when we talk about Crimea, exactly, there's no doubt about it that Crimea has been under the Russian sphere since Catherine the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, all of that. There's no doubt about that. But there's also international law that comes into play as well. And in 1990, after the fall of the former Soviet Union, there was a pact that was signed by both Russia and Ukraine with regards to the dual use of Sevastopol, the naval facility there. And they've been working in relative harmony, for the last 2 decades. But the people go about their daily lives. Many of them are ethnic Russians, some of them are ethnic Ukrainians. Again, a lot of this is being hyped up and whipped up by events that happened in Kiev, and certainly what's happened over the last 72 to 96 hours.
Colonel, when you were deployed there in Ukraine, was that the time of transition from a Soviet satellite state to an autonomous state?
Yeah, that's exactly correct, John. I was there in the mid-'90s, and then I traveled in and out of there in different capacities all throughout the 2000s, and so I would say yes. At that time, it really was the wild, wild East. Ukraine was getting its footing as a new nation. It's always been an old culture and an old soul, if you will, on the geostrategic front, but it was a new state, a new nation, and at the fall of the former Soviet Union, when it fell, Ukraine became the 4th largest nuclear power in the world overnight. And so they were trying to struggle with that. There's lots of talk now about should they have given up their nukes, should they not have given up their nukes. At that time, they were a fledgling nation, and we can see they're still trying to find their oats today.
We were part and parcel to the buying off of their nuclear arsenal. What kind of money did that cost us and the Western democracies?
Well, it was a huge undertaking under a program called Nunn-Lugar. It was a denuclearization of Ukraine. Russia signed off on it, NATO signed off on it, the United States signed off on it, and it was a constructive effort to go ahead and denuclearize Ukraine for a couple of reasons. Obviously, we didn't need a separate and potentially tension-filled nuclear standoff in the middle of Eurasia. And it did. It cost us a great deal of money to get those nuclear weapons and those nuclear material out of there. But I think in the long run, to denuclearize a country that was just brand new, it was a brand new country, it was a brand new nuclear power, and so people are now doing some Monday morning quarterbacking on whether that was a good idea or not.
Well, they might love to have that kind of leverage now, but I'm pretty pleased that they don't, frankly.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I mean, nuclear weapons are no joke. South Africa had them. They relinquished them. Brazil had the potential of going nuclear. It decided not to. Not everybody's trying to chase the nuclear tail. But, as a Ukrainian general told me at one point, he says, nuclear weapons, Frank, are like a genie out of the bottle. It's difficult to put back in.
Talking here with Lieutenant Colonel Frank Dowse, 20-year Marine officer. He was there at the embassy in Kiev. He led the military-to-military contact programs there in the mid-'90s. You've seen him on Fox and CBS. We've heard him on the Hugh Hewitt Show, and we're very gratified to have your expertise. Lieutenant Colonel, this is not a military question, but as an observer of the politics of Ukraine and Crimea, how Byzantine are they? Does anybody trust anybody? Do they change signs on a daily basis? Do they reshuffle the deck monthly?
Well, no, that's also very astute of you, John. It's difficult in that there's mistrust on both the Ukrainian and the Russian side. There's no doubt about it. There's lots of rhetoric that gets bantered back and forth, and very charged and very incendiary words that are thrown back and forth, both in Ukrainian and Russian. And this happens at all levels of the government, by the way. This happens at out there on the Maidan where you had the protesters, and there's no doubt about it. There are some hyper right-wing elements, though they're not nearly as hyperbolized as the Russians would make it out to be. But there's no doubt that there are right-wing elements that are in there. But in the end, these are people that have lived with each other over the last 20 years, especially in eastern Ukraine. They've gotten by knowing that, okay, we live in Ukraine, we're Russian speaking. Again, 90% of the Ukrainians speak Russian. So when Vladimir Putin and kind of wiki-deep pundits will talk about these issues, it's not so much about what they speak. Right? There's lots of people in southern Texas that speak Spanish. That doesn't make them Mexican. And I think this is something that gets lost in the frill. It's easy to kind of subdivide the country. Okay, this is where the Russian speakers are. This is where the Ukrainian speakers are. It goes a lot farther than that. These families have been blended together for decades, if not centuries. And so Ukraine has a very complex identity.
I feel like we are, with our particular history, our very young history in the States, that we just don't have any way to get our head around how things go in Eurasia or the Balkans, and this constant shifting of the lines of demarcation, and one family hates this family one week and they're allies the next week. I don't think we have any concept of that here, nor should we. I'm glad we don't.
Yeah, we're very fortunate that we are, relatively homogenized under our certainly under our Constitution, but also the idea that when you come into the United States, you are an American. My wife is. We met when I was living at the embassy in Kiev. She was the ambassador's translator. We met. We fell in love, and when she came to this country, it was the fact that she became an American was something that was really unique to her, in the sense that it wasn't about blood, it wasn't about ethnicity, it wasn't about creed. It was about her ability to be herself in a country that is very, very accepting of people like her. That
was a wedding that probably included a lot of background checks.
That it did. That it did.
I imagine it did. Thank you, sir, for your service to our country and your insight, spending some time with us this morning. I hope we can call on you again.
Absolutely, John. It was my pleasure, and have a nice day.
That is Lieutenant Colonel Frank Dowse here on our Turnkey.pro answer line, reminding us once again that the true definition of diplomacy is being able to say nice doggy while you look for a big stick.